The rain came down in sheets over the Odessa recruiting office, a persistent, icy drizzle that seemed to seep into the very bones of the young woman standing in line. Ludmila Pavlichenko pulled the collar of her coat tighter, her jaw set in a line that was far too determined for a 24-year-old history student. Around her, the atmosphere was one of frantic, patriotic chaos. Men shoved and jostled, waving papers, their voices a cacophony of urgency. The year was 1941, and the news had hit the Soviet Union like a thunderclap. Hitler had broken the non-aggression pact, Operation Barbarossa was underway, and the German war machine was chewing up the miles, hurtling towards them at a terrifying pace. When she finally reached the front of the line, the weary recruitment officer didn't even look up. He scribbled on a form, his pen scratching against the paper. "Nurses' Corps," he muttered, a statement, not a question. "Next." "I'm not here to be a nurse," Lyudmila said, her voice clear and cutting through the din. "I am a sniper. I have my marksman certificate and the Voroshilov sharpshooter badge." The officer's pen stopped. He lifted his head, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with an expression of weary incredulity. She was small, barely 5'2", with a studious face and thick, dark hair pulled back from her forehead. She looked more like the schoolteacher she'd been studying to become than a killer. A few men in line behind her snickered. One of them, a broad-shouldered sergeant with a week's worth of stubble, leaned towards his comrade and made no effort to lower his voice. "Did you hear that, Peter? The little comrade wants a rifle. Perhaps she can shoot buttons back on for the soldiers after they pop off from fear." The other man guffawed. Lyudmila's cheeks flushed, but she didn't turn around. Her focus remained locked on the officer. "I can shoot," she insisted, the words tight. "I've been training since I was 15. I can handle a rifle." The officer sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Look, girl, war isn't a shooting range. It's blood and mud and horror. It's no place for a woman. Your job is to patch up the men, make them tea, maybe write letters home for them. Be a good girl and go to the medical station." The snickers behind her grew louder. "A good girl," the sergeant repeated, earning a few more laughs. The sound was like acid on her skin. Lyudmila felt a familiar fire ignite in her chest, the same fire that had driven her as a tomboy on the streets of Kiev, the same stubborn pride that had refused to let any boy outdo her. She didn't move. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a carefully preserved photograph and a small, gleaming badge. She slapped them onto the officer's desk. The photograph showed a younger Lyudmila at a shooting range, her form perfect as she peered through a scope. The badge was the Voroshilov sharpshooter, a mark of elite proficiency. The officer picked up the badge, turning it over in his palm. The metal felt cool and undeniably real. He looked at the photograph, then back at her. The laughter behind her had died down, replaced by a curious silence. The sergeant leaned forward, trying to see what had silenced the room. "This is real?" the officer asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to professional. "As real as the Germans at our border," she replied. He stared at her for a long, hard moment. Then, with another sigh, this one of resignation rather than annoyance, he reached for a different stack of forms. "Fine. Report to the 25th Rifle Division, but don't expect to be welcomed with open arms." As she took the papers, Lyudmila could feel the eyes of every man in the room on her back. The disbelief was still there, but now it was tinged with something else. Confusion. She didn't care. She had her rifle, or at least the promise of one. That was all that mattered. The 25th. Chapayev Rifle Division was everything the recruiting office was not. It was mud-soaked, exhausted, and etched with the hollow-eyed terror of men who had already seen friends torn apart by artillery. Lyudmila arrived with her new Mosin Nagant bolt-action rifle, a weapon nearly as tall as she was, and was met with a wall of hostility so thick it felt like a physical thing. The sniper unit was a fraternity of men who had earned their place through blood and guts. They looked at her neat uniform and clean face and saw a publicity stunt, a camp follower, a distraction. "You'll be dead in a week," one veteran sniper, a dour man named Leonid, told her on her first day. He was cleaning his own rifle with the reverent care of a priest handling a relic. "This isn't target practice. When you pull that trigger, a man dies. You see his face. You see his friends try to drag him away. Can you handle that, little girl?" Lyudmila didn't answer with words. She simply found a spot at the edge of the trench line, loaded her rifle, and waited. For hours, she lay in the cold mud, observing the German lines through her scope, learning the patterns of their sentries, the way the light played across their positions. The men watched her, waiting for her to get bored, or scared, or cold. She did none of those things. She was utterly, immovably patient. This was the other side of her personality, the scholar who could lose herself in a book in the university library for an entire day, blocking out the world. Now, the battlefield was her library, and the enemy were the words she was learning to read. Her first kill came on the second day. A German officer, arrogant and exposed, had stepped out of his trench to issue orders. Lyudmila's breath misted in the cold air. She exhaled, let her body go still, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening. Through her scope, she saw the officer crumple, his map fluttering away in the wind. A collective gasp seemed to rise from both sides of the line. Leonid, who had been watching her from a few meters away, saw her chamber another round, her face pale but composed. She had done it. There was no celebration, no triumph, just the grim, stark reality of the act. But in that moment, the sneers from the men stopped. They didn't embrace her, but they stopped laughing. Over the next few months, the skepticism turned to awe, then to a fierce, protective respect. Lyudmila was relentless. She fought for 2.5 months during the siege of Odessa, her kill count climbing with each passing day, 10, 20, 50, 100. She had a preternatural ability to disappear into the landscape, to remain motionless for up to 18 hours in freezing temperatures, waiting for a single, perfect shot. The men in her division started to see her not as a woman, but as a secret weapon. They gave her their best positions, brought her hot food, and stood guard while she slept. The same sergeant who had mocked her in the recruiting line was now assigned to be her spotter. He never apologized, but he didn't have to. The way he shielded her from stray bullets and carried her pack spoke louder than any words. But war, she was learning, had a cruel sense of humor. It gave with one hand and took with the other. In the frozen winter of early 1942, now fighting in the hellish landscape of Sevastopol, she met a man, a fellow sniper named Alexei Kitsenko. He was kind, with a gentle smile that seemed wildly out of place amidst the ruins. He treated her not as a comrade or a curiosity, but simply as Lyudmila. He shared his rations with her, laughed at her dark jokes, and understood, without her having to explain, the weight of what they did. They fell in love with the desperate, all-consuming passion that only exists when death is a daily companion. They registered their marriage in the field, a brief ceremony in a bombed-out church, witnessed by soldiers with dirty faces. For a few precious weeks, the war seemed to pause. They fought together during the day, hunting German soldiers in tandem, and huddled together for warmth at night, whispering about the future, about the life they would build when it was all over. Lyudmila, whose first teenage marriage had ended in disaster and abandonment, allowed herself to believe in happiness again. Alexei, she confessed to a friend, made her feel like a person, not just a weapon. It was a beautiful, clear morning in March when it ended. The sun was actually warm on their faces, a rare gift. Alexei suggested they have breakfast outside their dugout, a small act of defiance against the gray misery of war. Lyudmila, craving the feeling of normalcy, agreed. They were sitting on a crate, sharing a piece of hard bread, when the world exploded. The Germans had zeroed in on their position. A mortar shell landed directly beside them. In a split second, Alexei lunged, throwing his body over hers, using himself as a shield. The shrapnel that would have torn her apart ripped into him instead. When the dust settled, Lyudmila crawled out from under him, screaming. He was still alive, but just barely. His arm was nearly severed, his body riddled with hot, sharp pieces of metal. She held him, applying pressure to his wounds, begging him to stay with her. A medic arrived and evacuated him, but it was too late. He died in her arms the next day, his blood soaking into her uniform, mixing with the mud and her tears. For 3 weeks she had known pure joy. Now she was alone. Something inside Lyudmila hardened into diamond after that. The grief was a physical pain, a knot in her chest that never loosened, but she channeled it all into her work. She became more than a sniper. She became an avenger. Her kill count soared past 200, then 250. She developed a special hatred for German snipers, the elite of the elite, and began hunting them specifically. She would stalk a single enemy sniper for days, learning his habits, predicting his moves. It was a deadly chess game played with bullets. One duel with a particularly skilled German lasted for 3 entire days. She lay in a shell hole, barely moving, not eating, scarcely sleeping, waiting for him to make a mistake. On the 3rd day, he moved a fraction of a second too soon. Her bullet caught him between the eyes. It was her 257th kill. It was also her 36th enemy sniper. To the Germans, she was no longer a joke. They knew her name. They blared messages over loudspeakers, trying to tempt her with chocolate and promises of a commission. When that failed, they threatened to tear her into 309 pieces, one for each of the soldiers they now credited her with. Lyudmila, hearing the threat, felt a grim satisfaction. They knew her tally. They were afraid. Lady Death, they called her. In June 1942, her war on the front lines came to a violent end. During a ferocious mortar attack near Sevastopol, shrapnel from an exploding shell tore into her face. She was evacuated by submarine, slipping away from the coast she had defended for so long, bleeding and broken. She had been at war for a year. In that time, her confirmed kills stood at 309, making her the deadliest female sniper in history. The Soviet High Command looked at their wounded hero and made a decision. She was too valuable, too symbolic, to send back to die in a trench. So they gave her a new enemy, the American and British press. Her mission was to persuade the Allies to open a second front, to take some of the pressure off the bleeding Soviet Union. Wounded, grieving, and suffering from the first creeping tendrils of what would later be called PTSD, the quiet, bookish historian was thrust onto a world stage. America in 1942 was a bewildering, infuriating place. It was a land of plenty, untouched by the famine and destruction that had consumed her homeland. And the press, with their cigars and notepads, treated her like a circus act. The first press conference in Washington, D.C. was a nightmare. The male reporters stared at her trim uniform, her pale face, the hero of the Soviet Union star pinned to her chest. They didn't ask about strategy, about the soul-crushing weight of killing 309 men, or about the desperate need for a second front. "How do you manage to keep your uniform so clean?" one asked. "Don't you find it heavy carrying that rifle?" said another. And then came the question that would define her tour. A reporter, looking her up and down with a smirk, asked, "Is it true that Soviet women are allowed to wear lipstick and makeup at the front? That uniform, the cut is rather unflattering. It makes you look quite fat, you know." Lyudmila stared at him. For a moment, the room went silent. She thought of Alexei, of his blood soaking into that very uniform. She thought of the frozen nights in the mud, of the faces of the men she'd killed, of the 309 pieces the Nazis had promised to tear her into. This man was worried about her waistline. Her eyes, the eyes of a sniper who had stared down death for a year, fixed him with a cold, unblinking gaze. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a firing squad. "I wear my uniform with honor," she said slowly, letting each word land like a bullet. "It has the Order of Lenin on it. It has been covered in blood in battle. It is plain to see that with American women, what is important is whether they wear silk underwear under their uniforms. What the uniform stands for, they have yet to learn." The room was stunned into silence. They didn't know what to do with her. She was blunt, unemotional, and utterly unimpressed by their posturing. But the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, saw through the uniform and the legend to the woman beneath. She saw the grief and the exhaustion and the unbreakable core of steel. Eleanor took Lyudmila under her wing, inviting her to stay at the White House, and accompanied her on a tour of the country. They became unlikely, fast friends. It was in Chicago, standing before a huge crowd, that Lyudmila finally lost her patience with the polite, indirect nature of the American home front. She was tired of being a curiosity. She was tired of the war continuing while people here worried about hemlines. She stepped up to the microphone, her translator beside her. She didn't talk about the heroism of the Soviet people. She didn't talk about politics. She looked out at the sea of safe, well-fed faces and spoke from the raw, bleeding wound of her heart. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice strong and clear, "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Do you not think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The question hung in the air, a verbal slap. For a moment there was dead silence. Then the audience erupted. They didn't boo, they cheered. They stood on their feet, clapping and yelling, the shame and the admiration mingling into a roar of support. The sniper had finally found her target. She had hit them right where it hurt, and in doing so, she had won them over. She had made them see. She returned to the Soviet Union a hero, but the war was over for her. She spent the rest of it training new snipers, passing on her lethal skills to the next wave of recruits. After the war, she finally finished her degree at Kiev University and became a historian, just as she had always planned. She worked quietly, living in the shadow of the memories that haunted her. In 1957, Eleanor Roosevelt came to Moscow. The Cold War was at its height, and the Soviet authorities tried to keep the two women apart. But Eleanor was as stubborn as Lyudmila. She refused to leave the country until she saw her friend. They met in a small apartment, two old warriors, and for a few hours the politics melted away. They talked, laughed, and remembered. It was a final, precious moment of peace for a woman who had known so little of it. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974 at the age of 58, felled by a stroke. The official record would state she died a hero, which she was. But the unofficial truth, known to those closest to her, was that the war had never really ended for her. She suffered for years from deep, festering depression and post-traumatic stress. The grief for Alexei never faded, and she struggled with alcoholism, a private battle against the ghosts that her public courage could not vanquish. She was cremated, and her ashes were laid to rest in Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery. But her true memorial is not a slab of stone. It is the story of a quiet bookworm who refused to be a good little girl, who faced down the mockery of men and the bullets of an army, and who looked a world of skeptics in the eye and dared them to hide behind her back for 1 second longer. The woman who just wanted a rifle had become, in the end, a legend.